Last time, we talked about the learning process in the teaching of grammar. Now, we are moving on to the teaching process. Also, under our subject, teaching and assessment of grammar. The teaching process. Now, how do we really teach grammar, or how can we teach grammar? Um, Teaching grammar means enabling language students to use linguistic forms accurately. So we want our students to be able to make use of the language form, to be able to make use of the linguistic forms accurately, in an accurate manner, meaningfully and appropriately. Not only accurately, but at the same time meaningfully. Can they apply it? Now, where can they apply those linguistic forms in an appropriate manner? So that is what we should bear in mind as language teachers, as grammar teachers. The next one, in keeping with language form approaches, traditional grammar teaching has employed structural syllabus and lessons composed of three phases. The first one, we have the presentation, practice, and production. Take note of those three: the presentation, practice, and production, often referred to as the PPP approach. Underlying this approach is the assumption that one systematically builds towards communication. So, the first thing that you should do as a teacher is to present, then ask the students to have a practice, then allow them to come up with their own statements and dialogues. Communicatively oriented approach. However, as mentioned in the introduction to this chapter these days, most teachers, we introduced last time that nowadays teachers embrace a more communicatively oriented approach, that there are a lot of teachers who would want their classes to be communicative. That is why we have this communicative language teaching, or the CLT, starting with a communicative activity such as task or content-based material. So it could be a task-based teaching or content-based. The grammar that is taught is not scheduled in advance, as it is with a structural syllabus PPP approach, but rather support students with their completion of the communicative task. There is already the task. If you want to make use of the communicative oriented approach, you provide them with the task, then the form, the discussion of the form will follow, or they are making sense of a particular content area. And moving on, in addition, alternately, teachers respond to grammar errors that students commit when engaged in communication. So the role of the teacher is to provide feedback on the errors committed by the learners. As such, it reverses the normal sequence, putting communication first. So, in this particular approach, you put communication first rather than selecting and presenting a grammar structure in advance of its use in context. So, there is the activity, there is a communication activity, and then the presentation of the grammar structure comes next. Even if the grammar to be worked on is derivative rather than scheduled in advance, a teacher must still decide how to address it. The teacher should be ready how he or she would be addressing the errors which are committed by the students. A variety of options have been suggested, although the research findings underpinning them are somewhat sparse and sometimes contradictory. One option is simple: to bring to students' attention, or to promote their noticing of, that they would be able to notice, that students can notice whatever it is, whatever content it is that you are trying to present, whatever grammatical feature or structure it is that you would want them to understand. For example, if a student makes an error and the teacher decides to respond to it, then the teacher might recast or reformulate what the student has said. The teacher can reformulate what the student has said or written incorrectly in a more accurate, meaningful, or appropriate manner. Reformulating. The student committed an error, then the teacher would reformulate it. For instance, if it is an error of form, the teacher would recast the student's production accurately. Like in this example, this is one notebook. Instead, the teacher would say, "Oh, that is Juan's notebook," perceiving the error to be the form of the possessive. I need to look at the word in the dictionary. Then the teacher would say, "You need to look up the word in the dictionary," perceiving the phrasal verb "look up" to be a better form for what the student means to say. Let's continue. Let's talk about input flooding. This is a more proactive way to promote students noticing a particular grammatical structure. We want the students to be able to notice particular grammatical structure. Um, what teachers would do is to highlight it in a text in some fashion. Enhancing the input might be an essentially effective way to focus students' attention on grammar structures that operate at the discourse level of language, such as articles or verb tenses. To continue by bold phasing all the normally insalient articles. So bold phasing, you would bold phase them in conversation, in text that you provide them, or in articles, in passages. The student's attention could be drawn to them. Even simple choosing texts in which a particular structure or structural contrast is especially frequent would enhance its salience. Now, you can also choose articles or passages wherein those particular grammar structures or language structures are present and thus might promote noticing. A practice sometimes called input flooding. So you call that particular strategy input flooding. Another one is consciousness raising. Still another option is to use a consciousness raising task in which it is the student's job to induce a grammatical generalization from the data they have been given. So you provide them with the data, you provide them with the text, with the passages, with the articles, and they can come up with generalizations. What were their generalizations? What were based from their analysis of the structures? For example, Forrest and Ellis ask students to work out the rule for indirect object alternation in English. So they gave a gold watch to him. They gave him a gold watch by giving the students example sentences where indirect object alternation can and cannot be successfully applied. You provide a lot of examples and then the students will come up with the generalization. To continue, indirect object alternation is difficult in English and therefore is an ideal candidate for this sort of explicit rule articulation. So, when the rules are not that clear-cut, detailed instruction with explicit metalinguistic feedback may be the most helpful response to students' errors. So, we can make use of this consciousness raising strategy if the there are no really there are very minimal available discussions about such topic and if the topic are quite difficult. Garden path strategy. What about this one? Another option for promoting students' awareness is to use the garden path strategy. As applied to grammar teaching, this means giving students information about structure without giving them the full picture. You provide them with a little information, thus making it seem easier than it is. So it would look easier the first time, leading them down the garden path. If ESL, EFL students were told that the English past tense is formed with ED, for example, this would be leading students down the garden path, as there are many irregular verbs in English. We know that there are many irregular verbs in English where this rule will not work. Wherein you cannot just add ED at the end to form their past tense. And later on, they would be able to realize, like walking in a garden, the reason for giving students only a partial explanation is that they are they are more likely to learn the exceptions to the rule if they are corrected at the moment the overgeneralization error is made. So they would commit an error, and that's the time that you can come up with feedback. That's the time that you can come up, that you can provide them with the explanation. When they overgeneralize, when they made use of that particular structure in all the instances, in all the examples, than if they are given a long list of exceptions to the rule. So instead of giving them a very long list of exceptions to the rule, then you can just do this particular strategy. Then we have input processing. Another technique for directing students' attention to form is called input processing. Rather than working on rule learning and rule application, input processing activities push learners to attend to properties of language during activities where the structure is being used meaningfully. So there are already activities wherein the rules are being applied, the kinds of structures are being used, and they would be able to make use of them, and at the same time, they would be able to analyze and come up with generalizations. For instance, if students are asked to carry out commands the teachers issue, they are working on matching the imperative form to its use in the meaningful way. Of course, sometimes a communicative task itself requires that students attend to relevant features of the target language, such as when using a particular grammatical structure is essential to completing the task. An example of this is when students have to use particular prepositions to accurately give each other directions using a map. The added value of using a communicative task to promote noticing is that students are encouraged to use the target structures, thereby generating output that attracts feedback from a teacher. So, since the students would be coming up with their own statements or their own outputs, then they would the teachers would be able to provide feedbacks on those particular outputs of the students, because they were somehow forced to speak up and come up with statements. Speaking of output, it might be surprising to experienced teachers to read descriptions of all these teaching options with very little mention of student production. So we're focused on student production. But of course, student production plays a very important role in learning grammar. It is not enough to have awareness raised if students can't produce the language. So you raised output production is therefore extremely important. For one thing, it pushes students to move beyond semantic processing to syntactic processing. From semantic to syntactic, from the meaning to the rules, to the structures, then to when students attempt to produce structures, they get to test their hypothesis. So they would be able to test whether their hypotheses were right or wrong on how the structure is formed or what it means or when it is used. They would be able to realize when those particular structures should be used. Following these attempts, as we have seen, they can receive feedback on their hypothesis and modify them as necessary. Then the role of the teachers is to provide feedbacks based on the hypothesis. The teachers would be the ones to tell whether their realizations were or generalizations were right or wrong. Indeed, Donato has shown how students' participation in collaborative dialogue, through which learners can provide support for each other, has spurred development of learners' interlanguage. It's another strategy, so collaborative dialogue, wherein students themselves would be providing support from one another, from each other. Other research corroborates the value of an interactive dialogue as both cognitive tool and means of communication. It's a cognitive tool wherein students learn the structures and at the same time means of communication. They can communicate with their peers, their classmates, which can promote grammatical development. So there are you're like hitting two birds with one stone. Beyond these reasons for giving students an opportunity to produce the target grammatical structures, we have already presented the idea that grammar teaching can better be thought of as developing grammaring, which will be discussed in our next meeting. Helping students be able to use grammar skillfully. When we say grammaring, it has something to do with helping students be able to use grammar skillfully, a goal that requires significant practice. But they have to practice and practice so that they will be able to be really aware of the structures. To this point, have Gatbonton and Segalowitz have argued that practice of grammatical patterns can lead to automatization of certain aspects of performance. When they keep on practicing it, then it's automatic that they would be able to make use of those structures, which in turn frees up students' attentional resources to be allocated elsewhere. It used to be that the practice phase of a lesson was devoted almost exclusively to grammar drills and exercises. That's what we do usually. That we come up with drills and exercises on grammar. Ever since the ineffectiveness of using drills which do not engage students' attention was acknowledged, there has been little by way of guidance offered on how to give students meaningful practice. Again, the role of meaningful practice, not just drills about those rules, not just exercises, not just quizzes, but meaningful practice. What follows, therefore, is an attempt to fill this void. Practice activities will be addressed in terms of which dimension of language they relate to. And that's it for today's discussion. I hope that you learned something about the strategies which we can apply as language teachers. Good day. Bye bye.